Thank you for the honor of giving this keynote at this wonderful conference. And I can't see you all listening, but I hope you can hear me okay. As Nathan said in his lovely introduction, I'm talking about Orwell and Empire today. And I mean, the kind of headline here is that Orwell's entire career was really forged in the crucible of empire. It was a struggle against what he saw as empire's most insidious feature, policing, which he felt corrupted both the souls of the police and those who were being policed, and it, in that way, just destroyed human bonds. At the same time, despite being such a critic of empire, Orwell actually long resisted the idea of actually ending the British Empire. So the question raised there is, was he simply limited, as a British man of his time? And what I want to argue in this talk is, I want to argue against that kind of easy out of just letting him be understood as a man of his time, and instead understand his kind of reluctance to imagine the end of empire as a result of the disabling future-orientedness of his political imagination. His presumption that struggles were the route to, rather than the very experience of liberation, that there's something to kind of get through in order to arrive at an equitable world of gardens and families gathered cozily around the hearth. And I think it was this future-orientedness that made Orwell repeatedly set aside his human commitments in pursuit of that prospective end. So fierce as his socialist commitments were, and fierce as his determination to divest himself of his inherited prejudices was, he was, in short, unable to escape the powerful eddy of liberalism, which was the ideology, if you will, that underwrote British imperialism. So to begin, let's start at the beginning, which is that Orwell actually owed his existence to empire. His great-great-grandfather was actually a slave owner in Jamaica. His great-grandfather was a wealthy absentee landlord of those plantations, and also a corrupt customs officer at Britain's Cape Colony. So the Blair family, they were the Blairs, they were among the slave-owning families that the British government generously compensated when slavery was abolished in 1833. And then even after that, the family continued to profit from colonialism. Orwell, or Eric Blair, as he was first known, was born in India. And here I'm gonna show you some pictures from his early life. And he was born in India because his father was at the time working in the opium department of the Indian Civil Service. And his mother was the daughter of a kind of speculating teak merchant in Burma, which was then administered as part of British India. So he was prepared from his days as a relatively poor boarding school student in England for what he called, what he imagined as a life of ruin, by which he meant, quote, the colonies or an office stool. And indeed, he wound up in the Indian Imperial Service in Burma. And here's an image from his training days in 1923. But he quit the police service after 5 years out of a deep sense of shame. And one of his first publications, a kind of essay short story that was called A Hanging, described the experience of a police officer in Burma, an English police officer in Burma, who is kind of quietly complicit in an execution there of a colonial subject. And critical as Orwell was in this piece of the kind of perversion of justice in British colonies, the essay still remains steeped in kind of racialized depictions of Indians and Burmese characters, whose kind of obsequious callousness was central to the depravity of the whole scene of execution. So here I want to pause for a second to talk about archetypes of this time and see how Orwell fits with them. This was a time of increasing doubt about empire, and the spy emerged as an archetype of British masculinity, kind of elevating stoicism as an ability to live with an internally fractured conscience. Think of T.E. Lawrence, or think of some of the heroes of Conrad's or John Buchan's novels. And Orwell also experienced a kind of internal division in his own self on when he grasped that the empire was what he called, quote, a evil despotism. The secrecy of your revolt poisons you like a secret disease, he writes. This is the voice of the teak merchant John Flory, who's the hero of Orwell's first novel, Burmese Days. Your whole life is a life of lies. So Flory lives inwardly, secretly, in books and secret thoughts, a corrupting way to live. And the whole system depended on a kind of thought policing. It is a world in which every word and every thought is censored. Free speech is unthinkable. You are not free to think for yourself. Now, Flory also has a kind of ugly, disfiguring birthmark. And to me, he recalls Frankenstein's monster in that. And he's actually longing for a companion all the time. And in the book, it's a character named Elizabeth, just like Dr. Frankenstein's kind of paramour in that novel. And he's longing for a companion to share this kind of otherwise isolated, very duplicitous life, and someone who would, love Burma as he loved it and hate it as he hated it. And just like the monster in Frankenstein, Flory ends his life with suicide. Now, Orwell himself had escaped Flory's the kind of fate that this fictional character Flory met by trying to expiate his bad conscience after quitting the police by living as a tramp in London and Paris. So he goes undercover and he's determined to, quote, submerge myself to get right down among the oppressed against their tyrants. And to him, England's working class seemed analogous to colonial subjects. They were the victims of injustice, playing the same part in England as the Burmese played in Burma. And in England too, just as in Burma, the police were, he said, the true source of the, quote, immoral conduct that they habitually pinned on the poor. So now he morphs into the writer George Orwell to document this experience. So he develops another kind of doubled identity and forges a kind of new self from the moral ruin of policing. And he frames the resulting book, his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, which comes out in 1933, as a kind of social experiment that forced him to confront the prejudices that his upbringing and his class had sort of bred into him. And now his decision to redeem himself among the oppressed in Europe, rather than in, say, South Asia, perhaps emerged from the sense of a kind of racial line that he couldn't overcome to go native, whatever his, quote, sympathy with the Blacks, as he put it, and that's his quote. But it may also have been a function of the limits of his sympathy. In his next book, that novel, Burmese Days, the figures who he calls the Orientals are, if anything, worse than their imperial masters. So it turns out that despotism is the fault of its subjects. So the kind of key figure in this is a Burmese character named Yu Po Khin, and he's described as someone with a, quote, barbaric brain, and he turns out to be the puppet master of the whole despotic trouble of this setting. So Orwell writes, if, quote, every man is a cog in the wheels of despotism, white men were also its true victims. They're forced to live in a kind of secret life while everyone is free in England. So to him, the civilizing mission that justified colonialism was humbug, but it was also futile because of the nature of the people it was trying to civilize. And that was a pessimism that was ultimately rooted in a kind of racism. So a couple of years later, he writes another essay short story called Shooting an Elephant. And in this, he really spells out the victimhood of the imperialist. The fable-like piece exposed the, quote, real motives behind despotic British rule. What you see is the crowd of sneering yellow faces. This is a quote, okay? Anything racist I say, please understand it's quoted from Orwell. And I apologize for the kind of triggering phrases embedded in this. The crowd of, quote, sneering yellow faces drives the main character, who is and isn't Orwell, it's unclear how fictional or not this piece is, drives him to shoot an elephant that he actually has no desire to shoot and even feels he ought not to shoot. So he writes, the futility of the white man's dominion was precisely that he seemed the leading actor, but was in fact merely an absurd puppet fulfilling the will of those yellow faces behind. And so when the white man turns tyrant, he writes, it is his own freedom that he destroys. So he acts the part, he acts this part as one long struggle not to be laughed at, to avoid looking a fool. That's what he explains. But this is a kind of unreliable narrator. His moral logic is meant to disturb the reader. And there's an interesting coincidence here where just a little over a decade earlier, there had been this infamous incident, the Amritsar massacre, whose anniversary is actually today on Baisakhi. And this Amritsar massacre in April 1919 had been committed, led by General Reginald Dyer. He was sort of the villain of the piece. And when he had to kind of justify his actions afterwards, he very famously defended himself by saying that if he hadn't fired, the crowd would have laughed and he would have, quote, made a fool of myself, right? So the question is, was Orwell kind of mocking Dyer's defense? The essay's ending also subverts that kind of self-absolving portrayal of natives as the real architects of their own oppression, because it ends with the kind of damning description of the logic by which the narrator actually becomes grateful that the coolie, the Indian working person that had been attacked by the elephant had actually died, because this put him, quote, legally in the right for shooting the elephant. So, we're supposed to judge the narrator for that immoral logic, right? So he's reproducing the logical acrobatics of imperialist morality to invite doubt about that kind of racist habit of blaming colonial subjects for their own subjugation. Nevertheless, though, even in his later work, that the very reduction of Englishmen to that kind of moral abjectness or hollowness for him still remained imperialism's greatest crime. So let's turn to another book that followed, which was The Road to Wigan Pier, where Orwell recounted how he had, in his youth, looked for redemption from imperialism by submerging himself in Europe's working classes, and how he had realized that England's police too were, quote, haunted by a secret horror of what they do, that same guilty conscience. But ashamed as he was of his colonial sins, including what he called the moments of rage in which he beat servants and coolies, he also absolved those sins as sort of systemically produced and an effect of race, because, Orientals can be very provoking. So you see, again, that blaming the victim. He even affirmed that seen from the outside, British rule in India, it appears and indeed is benevolent and even necessary. The biggest cost of that imperialism was to imperialists themselves, once again, forcing them into silence and kind of secret loathing of the system of which they were a part. And this sense of kind of martyrdom of the white man's moral burden really prevented Orwell from fully repudiating empire at any moment. So having seen the working classes in England as kind of analogous to colonized people, he condemned middle-class prejudice against working people precisely for the way it put them in that analogous position to non-white people. And so he complains that middle-class revulsion at working classes was even stronger than English revulsion at Burmese natives. And that Wigan, in this town of Wigan, decent, quote, this is again a quote, decent English people lived in worse conditions than, quote, coolies in Burma. So that was the whole problem. So Orwell was, of course, born white in India, and he could not but see the world through the racial lens that defined his identity as a member of the ruling caste, feeling eternally out of place and yet kind of privileged everywhere as an Englishman of a certain class. And he put this out of placeness to use in his adventures in Burma, in France, in Wigan Pier, in Spain. And here's just an image of him at the front in Spain in 1937. And these adventures allowed him to address an audience that he presumed shared his predilections and kind of vulnerabilities as a stock Englishman and thus a kind of default human being. So his attitudes were less about being a man of his time than being a man of a certain place in imperial society. So he writes this very anti-colonial account of his time in the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia. And it's very anti-colonial. He skewers the, quote, jingoes who egg this war on from the sidelines. And the book ends with a very fervent hope that his comrades will, quote, drive all the foreigners out of Spain. But his sense of the inevitable out-of-placeness of the kind of universal default human, the Englishman, also smuggles more dubious politics into this book. So once he makes the arrangements, to go back to England, he suddenly finds that he perceives Spain as in a new way, as something besides just a scene of war. So he writes, feeling more human and a little like a tourist, he felt that at last he was really in Spain, the European country that had most hold upon my imagination. So it's not the real Spain that he recovered along with this sense of his humanity, but an escape from kind of real Spain to what he called the, quote, far off rumor of the Spain that dwells in everyone's imagination. White sierras, goat herds, dungeons of the Inquisition, Moorish palaces, mules, girls in black mantillas, the wines of Malaga, gypsies, serenades, in short, Spain. So being human is for him to be English and thus possess the privilege to see the world romantically as a kind of orientalized source of delights for English imaginative consumption. And these imperial loyalties of this book, Homage to Catalonia, were so obvious that the book actually earned it had a preface by Lionel Trilling, kind of an American literary critic, in the kind of 1952 edition of the book. And in that preface, Trilling praises the book for valorizing the values of the British ruling class, which he listed as sportsmanship, gentlemanliness, dutifulness, and physical courage. So, even from the 1950s, it could be read as a very pro-British Empire text, despite its kind of anti-colonial vibe. In 1939, while Orwell was ill and convalescing in Morocco, he wrote another novel, Coming Up for Air. And as he wrote, and the main character is this philandering salesman named George Bolling. And as he's writing this book, George Bolling, the character, is also married to the daughter of an old India, an old India hand, like this British guy who works in India. And while he's writing about this, Orwell also starts to indulge his own attraction to sexual desire for Arab women in Morocco, and he gets his wife's permission to do this. So he sort of resumes the kind of colonial attitude and colonial gaze of his earlier Burmese days. And he writes also an essay called Marrakesh that year, which examined his racism and his sense of the invisibility of non-white people. So he writes, and I apologize for these words, but in a tropical landscape, one's eye takes in everything except the human beings. He's the same color as the earth and a great deal less interesting to look at. Offering himself as a specimen of whiteness, Orwell confesses that the sufferings of donkeys pain him more than the plight of Moroccan humans. People with brown skins, he writes, are next door to invisible. And black skins were no less inscrutable. He goes on, the Senegalese infantry are, quote, so black that sometimes it's difficult to see whereabouts on their necks the hair begins. As in his kind of unsparing confessional prose about class prejudice in earlier works, he's kind of daring to own what he knows his presumed white male readers also inarticulately think. So he notes, quote, the reverence before a white skin shown by a Senegalese boy who has been, quote, taught that the white race are his masters. But the line between self-incrimination and apology for racism is very blurry. For him, it's sad that white people cannot actually see brown people, but he says brown people actually are less interesting and are the color of the earth. So he notes here that, quote, every white man now secretly wondered at the sight of a black army like the Senegalese one he saw, how long before they turned their guns in the other direction towards their colonial masters. So he's kind of foreseeing anti-colonial rebellion on the horizon, but he cannot conceive of a role in anti-colonialism for himself. And as we move forward in time, in 1940, in this kind of famously controversial essay, Inside the Whale, Orwell suddenly starts to urge writing that captured everyday humanity over what he called overtly positive, serious, and constructive writing as the world faced the catastrophic onslaught of fascism and the Soviet betrayal of communism. They needed, quote, the human voice among the bombs, akin to what he called the ordinary man's passive, non-cooperative attitude towards the world process. Now, this phrase, passive non-cooperation, evoked the contemporary Gandhian anti-colonial movement. But Orwell uses that phrase here to call for resignation, utterly missing the uses of non-cooperation as a form of struggle. So for a Gandhian, self-rule at the level of the individual is precisely how one controlled or freed oneself from the world process. So Salman Rushdie wrote a response to Orwell in an essay called Outside the Whale, in the 1980s. And he explained that the life of ordinary men in 1940 of all times was not at all one of political passivity. If anything, especially in India, it was one of active world process making engagement. And in fact, many of Orwell's British contemporaries were very devoted to anti-colonial causes. For instance, Edward Thompson, father of E.P. Thompson, also had a lot of guilt for his earlier complicity as a missionary in India, that kind of complicity in empire, and he wanted to atone for that by, just like Orwell wanted to atone for his complicity. But Thompson did it by dedicating the rest of his life to the fight for India's freedom. So there were alternatives to kind of either quietism or simply waiting for colonial subjects to rebel, but they perhaps required more diminished racial feeling that Orwell didn't quite have. And Black and brown anti-colonial activists were right there in London within Orwell's reach. For instance, Ralph Fox, who died in Spain, was there at the same time as Orwell. He supported Indians who were founding the Indian Progressive Writers Movement. And Fenner Brockway, who Orwell knew, was involved in the India League and the League Against Imperialism, and was working with West Indian anti-colonial thinkers in London, like C.L.R. James and George Padmore. And Orwell was an admirer of the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was very close to the Indians in London who were working in the India League, and who even chaired the League himself at one point. It's possible that Orwell's constant movements, to Wigan and Spain and so on, prevented him from developing kind of intimacy with these networks, but he also shunned anything that to him smacked of fashion and what he called the whole public school, university, Bloomsbury bleaching tub of London culture. Now, when Orwell took up his pen with political purpose again, with the book called The Lion and the Unicorn in 1941, he was trying to assemble a case for leftist patriotism, and he homed in on the English hatred hatred for war and militarism as the English nation's most marked characteristic. And he acknowledged that this trait didn't fit well with the reality of the British Empire, but he argued in his defense that the working classes, who were the real England, were actually very ignorant of empire. So he accordingly skewered the kind of blimp class who were responsible for empire, according to him. The half-pay colonel with his bull neck and diminutive brain like a dinosaur, and his replacement, the well-meaning, over-civilized men in dark suits and felt hats, imposing their constipated view of life around the empire. It's such a great line. But confusingly, he also called out the Labour Party for being committed to the empire as a source of national wealth, which kind of made much of his earlier claim about the innocence of the working class. And then he undermined his critique of empire by affirming again that the average Indian suffers far more from his own countrymen than from the British. But then he acknowledged that this was an indirect result of the British rule, which aims half-consciously at keeping India as backward as possible. And these words in blue here indirect, and half-consciously were classic justificatory terms of liberal imperialism, and they kind of mitigated his critique. And a similar apologism pervades his kind of anti-racist positioning during World War II, in which he praised the English-speaking world and the British Empire for at least believing in human equality, if failing yet to put it into practice, while Hitler, on the other hand, couldn't bear the thought of a world in which Black men could be as good as white men. Now, to establish this anti-Nazi position, Orwell defensively kind of whitewashed British imperialism as entirely distinct from Nazism, just when thinkers like George Padmore, for instance, were pointing out the similarities and borrowings between Nazism and imperialism. So he writes, the militarized continental state with its secret police, its censored literature and conscript labor is utterly different from that of the loose maritime democracy with its slums and unemployment, strikes and party politics. So he kind of suddenly became amnesiac about the noxious censorship and policing that he had experienced in Burma and that was so traumatic for him. And he trotted out that typical liberal defense that life within the British Empire was in many ways better than life outside, and asserted, against his own witness and testimony of the everyday violence of British imperialism, that it was peaceful as no area of comparable size has ever been. So these equivocations about imperialism allowed Orwell to reject imperialism while nevertheless tolerating its continuity. Everyone knew, he said, that Labour's pledge to Indian independence was nonsense, because backward countries could no more be independent than a cat or a dog. So this was a very faithful parroting of the long-standing liberal defense of empire, that we would rather not rule, but it's our burden to bear. So rather than an end to empire, Orwell called for a positive imperial policy that would transform the empire into a federation of socialist states. And on India specifically, he advised a kind of doublespeak. Rather than an impossible freedom, they must offer India partnership while also telling Indians that they are free to secede if they want to. And he said Indians would certainly refuse this offer because as soon as they have the power to secede, the chief reasons for doing so will have disappeared. So Indians and the English would then work side by side for India's development. So entirely gone now is his old pre-war view of British rule as an unjustifiable tyranny. That is his quote, unjustifiable tyranny, he wrote in 1937. And this emphasis during the war on partnership was very much in line with British imperialists' shift from a language of trusteeship to repackaged empire at a time of kind of competing internationalisms like the League of Nations and international communism and various pan movements in this time. So actively supporting Orwell was actually actively, not just writing theoretically, but actively supporting continuance of British rule in India by engaging in propaganda work for the BBC Eastern Service during the war. And he also took time to defend the reputation of Rudyard Kipling, who's a famous imperialist author of the preceding generation. So he wrote about Kipling that however sadistically jingo his imperialism, Kipling's vulgar vitality sprang out of limitations which no fascist shares. And the modern totalitarians know what they were doing. The 19th century English did not know what they were doing. So he sort of reaches here for the liberal cover story about ends and means. And this is totally inconsistent with his absolute condemnation of Soviet communism, where he doesn't think ends justify means. He argues that it may be that all that Kipling's generation of imperialists did was evil, but they changed the face of the earth. And he homed in on India's railroads, which remain a kind of emblem of empire apology today. Now, the reality of imperialism periodically unsettled Orwell's newfound confidence in it. In 1942, which was the year of the massive Quit India non-cooperation movement in India, he wrote in his diary that the way the British government is now behaving in India upsets me more than a military defeat. But he remained convinced that for the next few years, India's destiny remained tied to Britain, because independence means the power to manufacture airplanes in large numbers, which India lacked, though he acknowledged British rule was precisely what had prevented India from acquiring that capacity. So instead of independence, Indians should aspire to a federated world, the only kind of world in which India could actually be free. Of course, he admitted to make such a plan credible, Britain would first have to get off India's back and declare it free, but then he realized British public opinion was precluding that route from opening up. So the Orwell, who we think of as such a plain-speaking thinker and author, really tied himself in knots over the question of Indian independence, allowing possible practical challenges to that independence to confound his ethical instincts. So we find him arguing both against empire and against anti-imperialism. We find him arguing against racism and against attacking British racism. It's a kind of doublethink. Which is his own concept, right? So he nurtured a kind of aesthetic and instinctual sense of the injustice of imperialism, and it's rooted in feelings of disgust, which are always deeply motivating for him. But he has this distaste for systematic critique, for a clear sense of kind of cause and effect. And that lets him remain kind of muddled in the way that the doublethink of liberal imperialism, the whole idea of spreading tyranny in the name of freedom, demanded. And so soon after he defended the peaceableness of the British Empire, in a 1946 essay, he actually called Politics in the English Language, he explained, he realized that language allows the defense of the indefensible, including, quote, the continuance of British rule in India. He even acknowledged that euphemistic terms like pacification veiled the actual inhumane violence of British colonialism. Now, these thoughts on politics and language were fueled by his growing awareness in these same years of racist language. And he was urging Britons to kind of separate themselves and distinguish themselves in their use of language from, say, Nazi use of language and racial language. So months later, it's the eve of India's actual independence, and we find Orwell finally abandoning his hope in an essay towards European unity that the empire could in fact be transformed into a socialist federation. And that hope had been betrayed by Britain's failure to liberate India and our attitude toward the colored people generally. In the war, if you remember, he had exonerated Britain's working classes, but now he anticipated the working classes would resist letting the empire go. And his new goal was now a socialist European federation without colonial dependencies, including Africa and the Middle East as autonomous republics on complete equality. And the first step to this was for the British to get out of India. So finally, he's on the right page. Now, after the war, Orwell was also working on his last novel, 1984, and he saw policing methods that had been designed to pacify and watch kind of subversives in the colonies being applied to unemployed people and crowds at home. So this book, 1984, was not merely about Stalinist Russia. It was also about the possible trajectory of imperious policing in Britain itself. And this is an argument about the secret state that E.P. Thompson would pick up in the 1950s. So the thought policing that Orwell had experienced in Burma has in this book become a kind of universal reality for the ruling party of Oceania. Like Florey from Burmese days and like Orwell himself, Winston Smith, again, longs for companionship, and he harbors a kind of sense of physical inferiority, even ugliness. And the inner party that he works for and secretly loathes, again, thrives on racism. Anti-Semitism infuses hatred of the fictional state enemy Emmanuel Goldstein, and posters depict the Eurasian enemy as a monstrous figure with an expressionless Mongolian face. In One Epiphany, we find Winston seeing through this manipulation. And he says, all over the world, hundreds of thousands of millions of people are held apart by walls of hatred and lies, and yet are exactly the same. And he understands that this racism abets Oceania's competition with the rival superstates to control the very regions that real-life European empires had ruled: India, the Middle East, Africa, and the millions of coolies, the slave labor of the coolies in those endlessly conquered regions. So sympathetic as Orwell is with the fate of those regions, in laying out the story this way, he was rehearsing his doubts about India's and these other regions' capacity for independence, their susceptibility to continual reconquest. Possibly, the book expressed Orwell's own guilty awareness of the doublethink that he did habitually indulge in on the subject of empire. And by doublethink, he meant the process of telling deliberate lies while genuinely believing in them, to deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while take account of the reality which one denies. A process that had to be both sufficiently conscious and unconscious to avoid a feeling of falsity and guilt. His writing, nevertheless, in this book, still remains suffused with racist depictions, such as the, again, apologies, little yellow men with incurious, sad Mongolian faces. And it's the same sense of the word Mongolian as in his first novel, Burmese Days. And racist denigration also pervaded the infamous list that Orwell compiled in 1949 for the British Foreign Office, which listed writers that he felt were not suitable to or trustworthy enough to produce anti-communist propaganda. And I've marked some of the places there where you see that. So he's continuing to struggle, even at the end of his life, to extricate himself from the prejudices he had absorbed from the institutions that had shaped him. And that tension is evident in one of his last essays called Reflections on Gandhi, in which Orwell expressed his aesthetic distaste for Gandhi, he had just been assassinated. He didn't like Gandhi's whole vibe of kind of homespun cloth, soul forces, and vegetarianism, but he praised Gandhi's lack of color feeling and his perception of all as equally human beings. Gandhi's insistence that we love all humanity rather than a single person was, however, a bridge too far for Orwell, the point at which the humanistic and religious attitudes ceased to be reconcilable. But Gandhi's aim was not, in fact, to withdraw from the pain of living, but to highlight the way that the liberal ethics that undergirded empire demanded that its subjects endure pain, instrumentalizing the present for the sake of civilizational progress, when in fact, civilization was an ethical state of being available to anyone now. Orwell resorted to precisely that justificatory logic in asserting that to be human was to be willing to sin for the sake of loyalty, which was arguably what he did with that list for the Foreign Office that year. His strategies for social and political recuperation were closer to Gandhi's than he realized. His subjection of himself to new experiences in order to slough off inherited class conditioning resembled Gandhi's efforts to decolonize his mind with his experiments with truth. Orwell's turn to gardening as a redemptive activity also recalls Gandhi's emphasis on absorbing craft-like work and village life. In his very first book, Down and Out in London and Paris, Orwell had come close to realizing that history's purpose was not to change the world, but to change us. In that book, he admired this one tramp that was named Bozo and who had been to India for being exceptional, having this exceptional sense of his own agency despite his social conditions. Bozo, he said, was free in his own mind. To him, poverty did not matter. Again, in his 1935 novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, the heroine, Dorothy, also recognizes the materialistic pseudo-religion of progress and finds a way out of worrying about the purpose, what is the purpose of worldly life, by just getting on with the job that lies to hand, by absorbing herself again in customary useful work. And Orwell himself distilled rich meaning from efforts that initially struck him as futile in Spain. Because obviously his side lost in that war. He had this, first feeling of kind of the futility that arose from his expectation that the battles that he was participating in had to lead somewhere, it had to, turn out well. But he later realized on reflection that the extent to which those battles had utterly transformed him, not least in giving him even ephemerally an experience of an equal society, he came to value that. So he closed his account by explaining that witnessing disaster had actually led him to believe more in the decency of human beings rather than succumbing to disillusionment and cynicism. Now, if we go back to 1984, we find Winston's mother having a kind of faith that an action that is ineffectual does not thereby become meaningless. And this very much echoed a kind of Gandhian refrain about the value of actions apart from their consequences. And Winston affirms, if you feel that staying human is worthwhile, even when it can't have any results, whatever, you've beaten them. If your object is not to stay alive, but to stay human, they could not win. The powerful could not win. And this is a view that Gandhi would have readily endorsed. Where Orwell parted with Gandhi was in his anxiety that totalitarianism robbed people of their awareness of the value of their feelings and actions, lifting them, quote, clean out of the stream of history. So, despite what he had learned in Spain, we find 1984 ending and Orwell's life ending in this sense of defeatism and the futility of resistance. And this kind of recurring despair that Orwell felt was a function, I think, of his inability to shake off the most influential prejudice of his class and culture, the idea that history is a story of progress rather than, as Rushdie puts it in that wonderful essay, the unceasing storm, the continual quarrel. The disappointment of the expectation of progress after he had worked so hard to attain it led Orwell to this kind of hopeless opposite conclusion that history is a story of unremitting defeat. So despite that epiphany about the value of his experiences in Spain, he never fully accepted the value of struggle in and of itself, regardless of what it achieved. He had a kind of second skin of liberalism, despite being a socialist, that prevented him from grasping the kind of non-consequentialist objectives of Gandhianism and from investing more in the anti-colonial movements of his time, whatever the real risks of neocolonialism, right? That's how he always talked himself out of it, by saying, well, there's going to be neocolonialism. So he writes at the end of this essay on Gandhi that Gandhi's life was not a failure, despite the violence of partition that came with India's independence, the division of British India into Pakistan and India. Because Gandhi had succeeded in his main objective, which was to end British rule. So here he's kind of attributing rather exaggerated powers to Gandhi, giving him credit for achieving all of India's independence. But he's also failing to imagine that Gandhi's life would not have been a failure even if independence had not come in August 1947, that Gandhi's struggle was worthwhile in itself, quite apart from the outcome it had. Thankfully, we don't do the same with Orwell himself. We don't look at his life as a failure, despite the fact that he was never able to help create the socialist brotherhood that was his main political objective. So to conclude then, I think we can look at Orwell as a critic of empire, also a believer in human equality, but a critic of empire and a believer in human equality who persisted in writing and thinking still in terms of race and empire. He was kind of an internally fractured imperial self. He's both inside and outside the whale. He did not anticipate the way his book 1984 would be actually co-opted into the American liberal imperial project during the Cold War. And I think the temptation to minimize his limitations as a kind of man of his time minimizes the extent to which his time remains ours because of that reboot that I just mentioned. The way that the values of Orwell's place, in the ruling class that defined what was human by its own reflection, those values continue to hold sway today, and that's why, and they compel that continual affirmation that Black and brown lives matter. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to any comments or questions you would have.